One country, two systems is the political arrangement under which Hong Kong now exists within the People's Republic of China. The short story of it is that Hong Kong was a British colony for about 150 or so years. The empire had first acquired it from the Qing Dynasty in 1842 after the First Opium War, expanded it in 1860 after the Second Opium War, and then added to it again with a 99-year lease of the new territories in 1898. In 1984, Great Britain and the PRC would come up with a declaration that would transfer sovereignty from Hong Kong to China. In order to allay concerns about what was going to happen to Hong Kong, Deng Xiaoping, China's paramount leader, came up with a system called One Country, Two Systems. After the Hong Kong handover in 1997, it meant that Hong Kong would be able to keep its way of doing business, its laws, and police force separate from China for 50 years, 2046. There's been a lot of protests, disagreements, fights, and lots of arguments over this philosophy of one country, two systems. And I'm not really going to write about that here, but instead I'm going to discuss one country, two systems' role in wooing Taiwan throughout the 1980s. One country, two systems was originally created for Taiwan, but it failed to woo them back. After Mao Zedong died, having failed to conquer the island militarily, Deng Xiaoping came to power. One of his main goals upon achieving power was to reunify the Chinese nation, which roughly constitutes what the Qing Dynasty used to have. Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan were the provinces sitting outside their reach. Hong Kong and Macau were at that time colonies ruled by the United Kingdom and Portugal. Getting them returned would be sensitive but achievable. After all, the colonial period was over, and the European powers that held those two cities were declining. And Deng would indeed eventually negotiate a handover. But Taiwan was a different issue. Deng quickly realized the PRC was operating under a critical ticking time bomb. Taiwan is different from Macau and Hong Kong. Those two cities were close to the mainland, and it was easy to ultimately threaten a military solution. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister at the time, had said that Deng had told her bluntly that China could easily take Hong Kong by force, stating that I could walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon. She would reply that there is nothing I could do to stop you, but the eyes of the world would now know what China's like. But ultimately, though, it would be ridiculous to think that that it would require a military solution to retake Hong Kong and Macau. The two cities depended heavily on the Chinese mainland to bring them food, water, and wealth. But Taiwan was different. Like I said, Mao showed that Taiwan could not be conquered by force. Prior to the Korean War, he had engaged in one of the biggest military buildups that had ever been seen in Chinese history. But the war derailed that work, and then the United States stepped in to provide military support. That implied military support continues today. You can check my other video for more information about Mao's final attempt to invade Taiwan. But basically, the gist of it is that the armed forces were just not ready to do so, and it would have been pretty crazy to try, considering that 100 miles of the stormy and definitely unfun Taiwan Strait separates the island from the mainland, and landing spots are few, far between, and well known. In addition, Taiwan is much larger than Hong Kong or Macau with 20+ million people, has its own food supply, and has diplomatic relations with the international community from its time as a Republic of China, including the United States. And yes, the ruling Kuomintang Party of Taiwan fought a brutal civil war with the CCP for about 20 years and hated their guts for it. As the 1980s came around, the island had been governing itself under the opposition Kuomintang Party for nearly 30 years. They had plenty of time to cultivate this separation and dislike amongst their 20 million people. Deng Xiaoping was undeterred by all of this. He truly felt that he was operating under a ticking timer, which was the desire, will, and authority for unification on the Taiwan side was starting to fade. And Chiang Kai-shek had been the Kuomintang Party leader, and after losing the Chinese Civil War, he had fled to Taiwan. There, he consolidated power, and his party, Kuomintang, ruled Taiwan with an iron fist, always with an eye towards retaking the mainland. But he would never be able to, but he never stopped trying. But crucially, one thing, he never tolerated opposition to the idea that Taiwan and China could be separate. He consistently and violently suppressed any movement advocating Taiwanese independence, and in this matter, he was in sync with the Communist Party. The dispute was over which side would rule. And as long as Chiang was alive, this would remain the case. He had the revolutionary military credentials to give him immense, unimpeachable authority throughout the party and the country. If he were to decide to reunify Taiwan, then it would happen. But he never allowed for this while the CCP ruled the mainland. But then in 1976, Chiang Kai-shek died. So who else had the same amount of authority as General Lee? Fortunately for the communists, Chiang's son, Jiang Jingguo, would come to power, and on the basis of being the acknowledged biological son of the leader and having significant revolutionary credentials himself, having rooted out corruption in Shanghai and fighting the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War, he became the next ruler of Taiwan. But Jiang Jingguo too wasn't getting old and in ill health, having had diabetes for decades now, and in the 1980s there was no obvious Kuomintang leader coming up behind him. And it was doubtful that they would even have the revolutionary credentials that CCKS and CKS had. Furthermore, if the CCP managed to come to terms with that leader, could that man push through a reunification decision to its people while holding back the growing sentiment of Taiwanese independence? It was unlikely. Deng Xiaoping, wife of Premier Zhou Enlai, made a speech in which she emphasized that if only they could talk to him face to face, then they would be able to resolve their differences and reunify the nation. She meant that probably more literally than you might think. The party believed, probably correctly, that they would be able to co-opt the will of the rest of the Kuomintang as well as the people of Taiwan by going through Jiang Jingguo. So thinking about Hong Kong and where the situation with Hong Kong, China and Britain negotiated on the colony handover without input from the Hong Kongers themselves. What happened? That would not be the case with democratic Taiwan. If the Communist Party cannot come to a decision with Jiang Jingguo, cannot come to a decision with the party elites of the Kuomintang, then the decision will eventually be put to the Taiwanese people, and what happens if the Taiwanese people decide that they prefer independence. So later on, Deng Xiaoping made a speech in which the first time he talked about the political approach that he created to lure the Kuomintang Party and Taiwan back to reunification. We have to accomplish the work that our predecessors have not accomplished. If we accomplish this task, this work, history will be much kinder to the father and son of the Changs, and others who have pushed for China's reunification. Of course, realization of national reunification needs to set a time limit. It could not be true if we said we were not anxious. Old people like us certainly hope the reunification will come about very soon. And after China came to terms with Hong Kong using the one country, two systems policy, Deng proposed it as a system for the reunification of Taiwan. Ye Jianying, PLA general, top leader, and crucial player in bringing down the Gang of Four after Mao's death, was one of the first people to float the idea, saying in 1979 that Taiwan would be a special administrative region like Hong Kong or Macau. He and Deng were off in agreement, and building on this sentiment, in 1982, after the agreement to return Hong Kong to China was signed, Deng said in a speech to the Central Advisory Commission, "The resolution of the Hong Kong question has a direct impact of the Taiwan policy. The Taiwan authorities should be able to accept the one country, two systems concept. In Taiwan's case, we would adopt an even more flexible policy. By more flexible, we mean that in addition to the policies used to solve the Hong Kong question, we would allow Taiwan to maintain its own armed forces." So the proposal largely followed that of Hong Kong, except Taiwan would be able to keep its armed forces as well as its economic and cultural ties to other countries. Formal diplomatic ties would revert to China, though. And there was also talk of Taiwan sending its top leader to China, to Beijing, as the number 2 leader. So this charm offensive continued throughout the 1980s. The army ceased hostile activities in the Jimin era. They had been shelling each other occasionally for a long time by then. Their propaganda started using phrases like liberation of Taiwan, and then the Communist Party moved to rehabilitate the image of Chiang Kai-shek himself as well as his son. Taiwan was not a super fan of this. Yu Guohua, premier of the government in Taipei, hollered that this proposal was treasonous and dangerous for the Chinese people for years to come. Jiang Jingguo himself held to his policy: no contact, no compromise, and no negotiations with China. China continued on, trying again and again to lure CCK into negotiations. Liao Zhenshi, a former member of the Kuomintang who knew Jiang Jingguo during their youth, would write a personal letter to the president appealing to childhood memories. "Recently, I was profoundly removed when I read one of your writings in which you expressed the longing for my father's soul to return to the homeland and be among the forefathers. The remains of your father, now still temporarily placed at Shihu, shall, upon national reunification, be immediately moved to his final resting place in Nanjing, Fenghua, or Lushan in fulfillment of your filial wishes. Throughout Taiwan, people of all strata are talking about their future. Time does not stay, and brief is the day. A long night invites bad dreams. I hope you, my brother, will make a wise choice and repair the house before it rains. What are you waiting for, staying away from home?" The letter would also bring up 2 events in history in which the Kuomintang and the Communist Party would team up to face down great challenges that the Chinese nation had faced. The Kuomintang and the Communist Party twice cooperated, and both occasions made tremendous contributions to the party. The second cooperation was presided by your father, and being participants in it, we know what happened there. Complicated as the matter was, an overall view of the situation will show that united, the country and the nation would benefit. Deng and his comrades would repeatedly bring up this idea of a third united front, as they would call it. And he would bring up one last time after Jiang Jingguo's death. This was a pretty terrible route to take, if you ask me, because the Second United Front, as the mainlanders call it during the Second Sino-Japanese War, was not remembered all that fondly by the Kuomintang. They had barely worked together, contrary to what the name implied, and for the most part, the communists used it to build their strength. So what more would they really want? One high-level CCP official asked in frustration. They really seemed concerned and puzzled as to why the Kuomintang would not accept these supposedly generous terms. As Jiang Jingguo's health declined, he began the Taiwanization of the government, bringing in more and more native-born Taiwanese into power. This was something that the CCP had definitely feared. This includes Li Donghui, who would eventually be the next president of Taiwan. So why didn't one country, two systems work out on Taiwan? I think the main issue is that Taiwan was kind of in a different situation from that of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony with no say in their own future. They never had. One country, two systems at that time was seen as just a switch of overlords. But Taiwan would lose a substantial amount more than Hong Kong with one country, two systems. Their government, at the time autonomously ruled, would immediately then become subordinate to the national government in Beijing. Jiang Jingguo might have personally wanted to return to the mainland, but it seems at some point as he marched towards the end of his life, he realized that it could not happen. In the end, Jiang Jingguo died, and the window closed. The Kuomintang would a few years later relinquish power in a way that the Communist Party has yet to do and probably would never do. The charm offensive would fail. A few years later, Deng Xiaoping would die having not seen reunification, and his fears would be realized. Taiwan became truly democratic, and from now on, the people would have to be included in any peaceful and likely non-peaceful reunification decision. China is still against Taiwan's independence. It also still thinks that one country, two systems is the right way to reintegrate Taiwan. Xi Jinping, in a meeting with pro-reunification parties, said so, showing a willingness to make concessions and be flexible, much as Deng Xiaoping was several decades earlier.